What if the person who destroyed your self-worth became the very reason you discovered your true value? This is Marcus Thompson's story, a young man from Detroit whose boss's cruel words, "You're worthless," became the catalyst that transformed not just his life, but an entire corporate empire. But success came with a price that almost cost him everything he truly was. Marcus Thompson had always believed that hard work would be enough. At 26, he spent his days mopping floors and emptying trash cans at Meridian Financial, one of Manhattan's most prestigious investment firms. Every morning at 5 a.m., he'd take the subway from his cramped studio apartment in Queens, arriving at the gleaming 40-story tower before the sun painted the city's skyline. The marble lobby intimidated him every single day. Italian marble, he'd learned from overhearing conversations, imported at a cost that exceeded his annual salary. Men in $1,000 suits strode past him as if he were invisible, their conversations about million-dollar deals floating through the air like a foreign language he desperately wanted to understand. But Marcus wasn't just a janitor. During his lunch breaks, hidden in the supply closet, he studied financial reports he'd rescued from executive trash bins. The numbers spoke to him in ways that surprised even himself. He could spot patterns, predict market fluctuations, and understand complex derivatives that seasoned traders struggled with. His notebook, a worn composition book from the dollar store, contained insights that would have impressed the firm's top analysts. The problem was nobody knew. Nobody cared to know. Richard Blackstone, Senior Vice President of Corporate Development, was everything Marcus wasn't. Ivy League educated, born into wealth, and possessing the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove yourself. At 42, Blackstone commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His corner office overlooked Central Park, and his custom suits probably cost more than Marcus earned in 3 months. On that fateful Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was cleaning Blackstone's office when he noticed something troubling in the financial documents scattered across the mahogany desk. Meridian was about to invest heavily in Aztec Energy, a company whose quarterly reports showed disturbing inconsistencies. The numbers didn't add up, and Marcus recognized the patterns of accounting manipulation he'd studied in his spare time. His heart raced as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a bad investment. It was potential fraud that could cost Meridian millions and destroy countless retirement accounts. Despite every instinct telling him to stay silent, Marcus knew he couldn't ignore what he'd discovered. He waited until Blackstone returned from his lunch meeting, steeling himself for a conversation that could change everything. When Blackstone entered his office, Marcus was still there, holding his worn notebook and wearing the same nervous expression he'd had since childhood whenever he was about to speak up. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackstone," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I noticed something in your Aztec Energy documents that might be important." Blackstone looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from annoyance to disbelief. "What did you just say?" Marcus swallowed hard, opening his notebook to pages filled with calculations and analysis. The financial statements show irregularities. Their revenue recognition patterns suggest they might be inflating earnings, and their debt-to-equity ratio is hidden through off-balance sheet entities. If Meridian invests the proposed $200 million, you could be looking at substantial losses within the next fiscal quarter. The silence that followed was suffocating. Blackstone's face transformed from confusion to fury, his eyes narrowing as he processed not just what Marcus had said, but who was saying it. "Are you seriously standing in my office telling me how to do my job?" Blackstone's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're a janitor. You clean toilets and empty trash. What could you possibly understand about complex financial instruments?" Marcus felt his courage faltering, but the numbers in his notebook gave him strength. "I've been studying finance for years, sir. I may not have formal credentials, but I can read financial statements, and these numbers—" "These numbers?" Blackstone exploded, snatching the notebook from Marcus's hands. "This is what you've been doing on company time. Stealing confidential documents and playing pretend investment banker." "I wasn't stealing, Mr. Blackstone. I was just—" "You were just what? Thinking. That's your first mistake." Blackstone's laugh was cruel and sharp. "Let me explain something to you, Marcus Thompson. You're worthless. Not just as an employee, but as a human being who thinks he can rise above his station. You're a janitor because that's all you'll ever be. You don't have the education, the background, or the intelligence to understand what happens in this building. Each word hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around them, other employees had begun to notice the commotion, faces appearing in doorways and cubicles as Blackstone's voice rose. You want to know why men like me succeed and people like you scrub our floors? Blackstone continued, his voice carrying across the office. It's not luck. It's breeding. It's education. It's generations of excellence that you could never comprehend. You think reading some numbers makes you qualified to give me advice? You're delusional. Marcus felt his face burning with humiliation as colleagues whispered and stared. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed amused by the spectacle. But what hurt most was the recognition in their eyes, the acknowledgement that Blackstone was saying out loud what many of them probably thought privately. Sir, I understand you're upset, but if you just look at the analysis— The analysis? Blackstone ripped several pages from Marcus's notebook, tossing them into the air like confetti. This is garbage, juvenile scribbling from someone who doesn't understand the first thing about institutional finance. You're embarrassing yourself, and you're embarrassing this company by thinking you belong in conversations with your betters. The pages floated to the floor like broken dreams, months of careful study and genuine insight reduced to litter in front of an audience of Marcus's peers and superiors. He knelt to gather the scattered papers, his hands shaking as he tried to collect the pieces of work that had represented hope and ambition. Don't you dare pick up that trash in my office, Blackstone commanded. Leave it. Let everyone see what happens when people forget their place. Marcus straightened slowly. His notebook clutched against his chest like armor that had already failed him. The office had gone completely silent, 30 pairs of eyes watching his humiliation unfold. I want you to remember this moment, Blackstone said, his voice now calm and controlled, which somehow made it worse. Every time you empty my wastebasket, every time you mop these floors, remember that you are exactly where you belong. You are worthless, Marcus Thompson, and pretending otherwise only makes you pathetic. As Marcus walked away from Blackstone's office, his fellow janitor Carlos approached him with concerned eyes. Hermano, you okay? That was brutal, man. But Marcus couldn't respond. The words, "You're worthless," echoed in his mind, mixing with every doubt he'd ever had about himself, every moment when he'd wondered if dreaming beyond his circumstances was just self-deception. That night, in his small apartment, Marcus sat staring at his damaged notebook. Half the pages were gone, torn and scattered across Blackstone's office floor. But something strange happened as he looked at the remaining analysis. Instead of feeling defeated, a quiet anger began to build, not at Blackstone, but at a system that judged worth by circumstances rather than capability. He opened his laptop, a refurbished machine he'd bought for $50, and began to research Aztec Energy more thoroughly. If Blackstone wanted to ignore his warning, that was his choice. But Marcus would be ready for what came next. 3 weeks after his humiliation, Marcus watched from the break room as chaos erupted across Meridian's trading floor. The Aztec Energy scandal had broken that morning, just as Marcus had predicted. The FBI was investigating the company for massive accounting fraud, and their stock price had collapsed overnight, wiping out Meridian's $200 million investment in a matter of hours. Blackstone's voice carried across the office as he barked orders into his phone, trying desperately to minimize the damage. How could our due diligence miss this? I want every analyst who approved this deal in my office now. Marcus sipped his coffee quietly, watching the man who had called him worthless scramble to explain how he'd missed obvious signs of fraud. There was no satisfaction in being right, only a growing certainty that he couldn't continue living as if other people's opinions determined his value. During his lunch break, instead of hiding in the supply closet, Marcus took the elevator to the building's observation deck. The city spread out below him, millions of people pursuing their dreams and ambitions. Somewhere in that vast landscape were people who had started with less than him and achieved extraordinary things. The question wasn't whether he was capable, it was whether he was brave enough to bet on himself. That afternoon, he began his transformation. Marcus enrolled in online finance courses using every spare dollar from his paycheck. He woke up at 4 a.m. instead of 5 to study before work. He used his evening hours to practice financial modeling and analysis. Most importantly, He started documenting his insights not in a dollar store notebook, but in professional reports that he emailed to himself, creating a portfolio of his analytical capabilities. The work was exhausting, but each late night felt like an act of rebellion against Blackstone's crushing words. Every concept he mastered was proof that intelligence and determination mattered more than pedigree. 6 months later, Marcus had completed advanced certifications in financial analysis and portfolio management. His insights were sharper, his confidence stronger, and his vision clearer. But he was still mopping floors at Meridian, still invisible to the people who made decisions. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday morning when Eleanor Harrison walked into the building. Eleanor was a legend in the financial world, a self-made billionaire who had built Harrison Capital from nothing after being passed over for promotion at every major firm in the city. At 55, she was known for her brilliance, her integrity, and her ability to spot talent where others saw only obstacles. She was at Meridian to discuss a potential merger, but what caught her attention was something entirely unexpected. As she waited in the lobby for her meeting, she noticed a young man in a janitor's uniform reading a complex financial analysis on his phone. Most people would have assumed he was scrolling through social media, but Eleanor recognized the telltale signs of someone deeply engaged with sophisticated material. "Excuse me," she said, approaching Marcus during a brief moment when the lobby was empty. "I couldn't help but notice what you're reading. That's a pretty advanced derivatives analysis." Marcus looked up, startled to find himself face-to-face with someone he'd only seen in business magazines. Eleanor Harrison was smaller than he'd expected, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. "Yes, ma'am. I was reviewing some hedging strategies for commodity exposure." "For work?" Marcus hesitated, unsure how to explain his situation without sounding desperate or delusional. "For personal education. I study finance in my spare time." Eleanor's expression grew more interested. "What's your background?" "Honestly, I clean offices here, but I've been teaching myself financial analysis for the past few years. I find the markets fascinating." Something in Marcus's straightforward honesty seemed to resonate with Eleanor. She had built her fortune by recognizing talent where others saw only conventional credentials, and this young man possessed something that couldn't be taught: genuine intellectual curiosity combined with deep analytical thinking. "Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Eleanor said, settling into one of the lobby's leather chairs. "I'm curious about your perspective on current market conditions." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus found himself in the most engaging conversation of his professional life. Eleanor didn't talk down to him or question his qualifications. Instead, she listened as he explained his analysis of emerging market trends, his concerns about over-leveraged corporate debt, and his thoughts on how technological disruption was reshaping entire industries. "Your insights are remarkably sophisticated," Eleanor said finally. "Have you considered pursuing this professionally?" Marcus felt the familiar sting of his limitations. "I'd love to, but I don't have an MBA or connections in the industry. Most firms won't even consider someone without the right background." Eleanor smiled, remembering her own struggles against similar prejudices decades earlier. "The right background or the right performance? What do you mean?" "I mean that markets don't care where you went to school. They only care whether you're right." She stood up, extending her business card. "I'm always looking for talented analysts who can see what others miss. Would you be interested in interviewing for a position at my firm?" Marcus stared at the card as if it were written in a foreign language. Eleanor Harrison, one of the most successful investors in the world, was offering him an opportunity based on a 20-minute conversation in a lobby. "Are you serious?" "I'm always serious about talent." "Send me your resume and a sample of your analytical work. If your insights are as sharp on paper as they are in person, we should talk." That evening, Marcus worked until 3 a.m. preparing materials for Eleanor. He compiled his best analyses, wrote a comprehensive cover letter explaining his unconventional background, and crafted a professional resume that emphasized his achievements rather than his current job title. As he hit send on the email that could change his life, Marcus thought about Blackstone's words. "You're worthless." For months, those words had haunted him. But sitting in his small apartment, surrounded by textbooks and financial reports, he realized that worthiness wasn't something other people could grant or take away. It was something he had to claim for himself. The response came faster than he'd expected. Eleanor's assistant called the next morning to schedule an interview for the following week. As Marcus hung up the phone, he looked around the Meridian building with new eyes. This place that had once seemed like the pinnacle of success now felt like a stepping stone to something greater. But first, he had to navigate the most important meeting of his life, knowing that everything he'd worked for depended on proving that talent and determination could overcome prejudice and circumstance. The Harrison Capital offices occupied 3 floors of a sleek building in Midtown Manhattan, a space that radiated success without the ostentatious displays of wealth that characterized places like Meridian. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early for his interview, his best suit, purchased that weekend for more than he typically spent on groceries in a month, fitting him like armor for the battle ahead. Eleanor's assistant, a composed woman in her 30s named Sarah, greeted him warmly. "Ms. Harrison is running a few minutes behind, but she asked me to let you know she's very much looking forward to your conversation." The waiting area was filled with financial journals and reports, but Marcus was too nervous to read. Instead, he reviewed the presentation he'd prepared, a comprehensive analysis of undervalued semiconductor companies that he believed were positioned for significant growth. When Eleanor finally appeared, she seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Marcus, thank you for coming. I've read your materials, and I'm impressed. Shall we begin?" The interview lasted 2 hours. Eleanor didn't just ask about Marcus's background. She challenged his investment theses, questioned his assumptions, and pushed him to defend his analytical methods. It was exhausting and exhilarating, the kind of intellectual rigor that Marcus had craved for years, but never experienced. "Your analysis of the semiconductor sector is particularly insightful," Eleanor said as they neared the end of their conversation. "You've identified trends that our senior analysts missed. How did you develop this perspective?" Marcus thought carefully before responding. "When you're outside the system, you see things differently. I didn't have access to expensive research reports or industry connections, so I had to learn to read between the lines of public information. Sometimes that outsider perspective reveals patterns that insiders take for granted." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking I value. Fresh perspectives uncontaminated by groupthink." At the end of the interview, Eleanor made an offer that took Marcus's breath away. "I'd like you to join Harrison Capital as a junior analyst. The starting salary is $85,000, with performance bonuses based on the success of your recommendations. You'd work directly with our senior team on client portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Marcus felt dizzy. The salary alone was more than triple what he earned at Meridian. But beyond the money was something infinitely more valuable: the chance to prove that Richard Blackstone had been catastrophically wrong about his worth. "I accept," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "Excellent. When can you start?" "I need to give 2 weeks' notice at my current position." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Ah, yes, Meridian Financial. I'm familiar with their culture. I'm sure they'll be surprised by your career transition." The next morning, Marcus walked into Meridian for the last time as a janitor. He'd crafted his resignation letter carefully, keeping it professional and brief. But as he approached the HR office, he encountered Richard Blackstone in the elevator. "Well, if it isn't our aspiring analyst," Blackstone said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Still pretending you understand finance?" Marcus looked at the man who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating. Blackstone was the same person who had humiliated him 8 months ago, but Marcus was not. The months of study, the validation from Eleanor, and the growing confidence in his abilities had fundamentally changed how he saw himself and his place in the world. "Actually, Mr. Blackstone, I've accepted a position as a junior analyst at Harrison Capital." The elevator fell silent. Blackstone's expression shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching disbelief. "Harrison Capital? Eleanor Harrison's firm?" "Yes, sir. Ms. Harrison was impressed with my analytical capabilities and offered me a position working directly with her senior team." Blackstone's face flushed red. Harrison Capital was one of the most prestigious investment firms in the city, known for its selective hiring practices and exceptional performance. The idea that a janitor from his building had been recruited by Eleanor Harrison was almost incomprehensible. "That's impossible. You're a maintenance worker. You don't have the qualifications for a position like that." Apparently, Ms. Harrison disagrees. She seemed to value analytical insight over traditional credentials. The elevator reached Marcus's floor, and as the doors opened, he turned to face Blackstone one last time. "You told me I was worthless, Mr. Blackstone. I wanted to thank you for that." "Thank me?" "Yes. Your words forced me to decide whether I was going to accept your judgment or prove it wrong. Today, I start proving it wrong." As Marcus stepped out of the elevator, he heard Blackstone call after him, but the doors were already closing. That afternoon, Marcus cleaned out his locker, said goodbye to Carlos and the other custodial staff who had become his friends, and walked out of Meridian Financial forever. His first day at Harrison Capital was overwhelming in the best possible way. He was assigned a desk on the 42nd floor with a view of the Hudson River, given access to research databases worth millions of dollars, and introduced to colleagues who treated him as an equal rather than an invisible service provider. Within 3 months, Marcus's semiconductor analysis had generated 15% returns for the firm's clients, earning him recognition as one of Harrison Capital's most promising junior analysts. Within 6 months, he was managing portions of major client portfolios. Within a year, he was earning more money than he'd ever imagined possible. But success brought unexpected challenges. The long hours and intense pressure of high-stakes investing began to consume his life. He moved to a luxury apartment in Manhattan, bought expensive suits and watches, and found himself surrounded by the trappings of success. Yet something felt wrong. The break-room conversations at Harrison Capital weren't that different from the ones at Meridian. They just involved larger numbers. His colleagues were brilliant and dedicated, but many seemed to have lost touch with the human impact of their decisions. When they discussed laying off thousands of workers to improve quarterly earnings, or closing factories to boost stock prices, the conversations felt abstract and disconnected from real consequences. Marcus began to wonder if climbing the ladder meant becoming someone he didn't recognize. The hungry, determined young man who had studied financial reports and supply closets was being replaced by someone who measured worth in portfolio performance and designer accessories. Late one evening, as he worked alone in his office reviewing acquisition targets, Marcus realized he hadn't spoken to his family in Detroit in weeks. He hadn't visited his old neighborhood, hadn't maintained friendships with people who knew him before his transformation. Success was isolating him from the connections that had once grounded him. The person staring back at him from his office window looked successful and confident, but Marcus wasn't sure he liked who he was becoming. The question that haunted him was whether achieving everything he'd dreamed of was worth losing everything he'd been. 2 years into his career at Harrison Capital, Marcus had become everything he'd once admired from afar. His apartment overlooked Central Park. His closet was filled with custom suits, and his investment recommendations were generating millions in profits for the firm's wealthy clients. By every external measure, he had proven Richard Blackstone catastrophically wrong about his worth and potential. But success had come with a price he hadn't anticipated. The young man who once studied financial reports while eating peanut butter sandwiches now attended $100 lunches where he barely touched $30 appetizers. He'd gained access to exclusive clubs and social circles, but lost touch with the people and experiences that had shaped his character. The transformation became starkly apparent during a client presentation in December. Marcus was explaining his latest investment strategy to the Pemberton Family Trust, a group that managed wealth accumulated over 4 generations. As he detailed how they could increase returns by investing in companies that were relocating manufacturing jobs overseas, something in his presentation struck him as fundamentally wrong. "The beauty of this approach," Marcus heard himself saying, "is that labor arbitrage allows these companies to maintain profit margins while reducing operational costs. We're looking at potential returns of 12 to 15% over the next 18 months. Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, the trust's elderly matriarch, asked a question that caught Marcus off guard. "Young man, what happens to the American workers whose jobs are being relocated?" Marcus had prepared for technical questions about risk management and portfolio allocation, not inquiries about human impact. "Well, that's unfortunate, but market forces drive efficiency, and our responsibility is to maximize returns for our investors." The words felt foreign in his mouth, like he was channeling someone else's philosophy. "Mrs. Pemberton nodded politely, but her expression suggested disapproval rather than appreciation for his analytical sophistication. After the presentation, Eleanor pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation in her office. "That was an excellent technical presentation," she began, "but I sensed something was bothering you during the discussion about job displacement." Marcus hesitated, unsure how to articulate his growing discomfort with the ethical implications of some investment strategies. "It's just, I keep thinking about the people affected by these decisions. When we profit from companies that eliminate jobs, we're benefiting from other people's economic hardship." Eleanor studied him carefully. "You're experiencing something that happens to many successful analysts around your stage of career development. You're questioning whether financial success is worth the moral compromises required to achieve it. Is that normal? It's more than normal. It's essential." The analysts who don't wrestle with these questions often become the kind of people who see human beings as economic variables rather than individuals with families and dreams. That evening, Marcus found himself walking through his old neighborhood in Queens for the first time in months. The bodega where he'd bought coffee every morning, the subway station where he'd studied financial reports during his commute, the small apartment building where he'd lived paycheck to paycheck. Everything looked smaller and shabbier than he remembered, but also somehow more real than the polished world he now inhabited. His former neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, spotted him from her window and invited him in for coffee. Her tiny apartment was exactly as he remembered, filled with family photos and the smell of homemade cooking. As they talked, Marcus realized how much he missed conversations that weren't about market volatility and investment returns. "You look successful, mijo," Mrs. Rodriguez said, noting his expensive clothes and confident demeanor. "But do you look happy?" The question haunted him for weeks. Marcus began to examine his life with the same analytical rigor he applied to investment opportunities. What he discovered was troubling. He had gained financial security and professional recognition, but lost connections to the values and relationships that had once motivated him. The realization crystallized during a company retreat in the Hamptons. Harrison Capital's senior staff had gathered for a weekend of strategic planning and team building at Eleanor's estate. As Marcus sat by the pool, surrounded by colleagues discussing their latest acquisitions and luxury purchases, he felt profoundly disconnected from the conversations and the people having them. During a break in the meetings, Marcus found Eleanor alone on her terrace, looking out at the ocean. "You seem troubled lately," she observed. "Want to talk about what's bothering you?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "I'm grateful for everything you've given me, the opportunity, the mentorship, the financial success. But I'm struggling with whether I'm becoming someone I don't like in the process." Eleanor smiled with understanding. "I went through something similar about 10 years into my career. I had achieved everything I thought I wanted, but felt empty and disconnected from my original motivations. How did you resolve it?" "By remembering why I got into this business in the first place. It wasn't just to make money. It was to prove that intelligence and hard work could overcome prejudice and limited opportunities. Once I reconnected with that mission, I found ways to use success as a platform for creating positive change, rather than just accumulating wealth." Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with an urgent message. One of his former colleagues from Meridian Financial was reaching out with disturbing news. Richard Blackstone was being investigated by the SEC for insider trading and had been quietly asked to resign from the firm. The irony was profound. The man who had declared Marcus worthless based on his background and position was being exposed as someone who had compromised his ethics and integrity for financial gain. Meanwhile, Marcus had built his success on honest analysis and legitimate expertise, but was questioning whether he was losing his soul in the process. As Marcus drove back to Manhattan that Sunday evening, he made a decision that would define the next phase of his career and his life. Success wasn't just about proving Richard Blackstone wrong. It was about becoming someone worthy of the opportunities he'd been given. The challenge wasn't just climbing higher, but ensuring he remained connected to the values and people that had shaped him along the way. The reckoning he faced wasn't with his former boss or external critics, but with the person he was becoming and the person he wanted to remain. The news of Richard Blackstone's downfall spread through Manhattan's financial district like wildfire. Securities fraud, insider trading, and obstruction of justice. The charges painted a picture of a man whose arrogance had led to systematic corruption. As Marcus read the headlines over his morning coffee, he felt no satisfaction in his former tormentor's destruction. Only a sobering reminder of how success without integrity ultimately leads to failure. Eleanor had been right about the importance of reconnecting with his original motivations. But Marcus realized that proving Blackstone wrong wasn't enough. He needed to prove something to himself about who he could become when success was paired with purpose. The opportunity came sooner than expected. During a partners meeting at Harrison Capital, Eleanor announced that the firm had been approached by the Detroit Municipal Pension Fund, which managed retirement savings for thousands of city workers, including teachers, firefighters, and police officers. The fund was seeking investment management services for their $3 billion portfolio. "It's not our typical client profile," Eleanor explained. "The fee structure is lower than what we normally accept, and the political scrutiny is intense. But it's an opportunity to have meaningful impact on working families' financial security." Marcus's mind immediately went to his father, a retired auto worker whose pension had been decimated during Detroit's bankruptcy. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez and countless other people whose retirement security depended on the competent management of funds like this one. "I'd like to lead this engagement," Marcus said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. The room fell silent. Managing a municipal pension fund was considered less prestigious than handling private wealth, and the profit margins were significantly lower. "Are you sure?" Eleanor asked. "This would be a major commitment, and it might slow your progression to senior roles managing higher-value clients." "I'm sure. This is exactly the kind of work that matters to me." Over the next 6 months, Marcus threw himself into the Detroit pension project with the same intensity he'd once brought to studying financial reports in supply closets. But now his motivation was different. Instead of trying to prove his worth to skeptics, he was working to secure the retirement dreams of people whose backgrounds mirrored his own. The work was complex and politically sensitive. Detroit's financial situation remained precarious, and every investment decision faced scrutiny from city council members, union representatives, and local media. Marcus had to balance the need for stable returns with the political reality that controversial investments could undermine public confidence in the fund. His breakthrough came when he identified a portfolio strategy focused on infrastructure investments that would generate steady returns while creating jobs in Detroit and other Rust Belt cities. Instead of profiting from companies that eliminated American jobs, Marcus structured investments that revitalized communities while providing pension fund beneficiaries with secure returns. The strategy was unconventional but brilliant. By investing pension funds in projects that rebuilt America's infrastructure, Marcus created a virtuous cycle where workers' retirement savings helped fund projects that created jobs for their children and grandchildren. Eleanor was impressed, but more importantly, the results spoke for themselves. After 12 months under Marcus's management, the Detroit Pension Fund had generated returns that exceeded expectations while maintaining the kind of ethical investment profile that allowed fund managers to sleep soundly at night. The success attracted attention from other municipal funds, labor unions, and socially conscious investors. Within 2 years, Marcus had built a specialized practice within Harrison Capital, focused on responsible investing for working-class retirement funds and union pension plans. The work was personally fulfilling in ways that traditional wealth management had never been. When Marcus received letters from retired teachers thanking him for protecting their pension security, or met with union representatives whose members were building infrastructure projects funded by pension investments, he felt connected to something larger than quarterly performance numbers. But the most meaningful moment came during a return visit to Detroit for a pension fund board meeting. Marcus had arranged to meet his father for dinner at the same diner where they'd shared countless meals during his childhood. His father, Robert Thompson, studied his son with the careful attention of someone who had watched Marcus transform from a struggling young man into a confident professional. "You look different," he observed, "not just successful, satisfied." "What do you mean?" "When you first got that fancy job in New York, you looked successful but stressed, like you were trying to prove something to people who didn't matter. Now you look like you're working on something that matters to you." Marcus realized his father was right. The angry determination that had driven him to prove Blackstone wrong had been replaced by a quieter satisfaction that came from aligning his work with his values. "I'm managing the city's pension fund now," Marcus explained. "The same fund that pays your retirement benefits." Robert Thompson's expression grew serious. "So you're the one making sure I can keep my house and buy my medications?" I'm part of the team, yes. Then you're doing something that matters. That's worth more than all the fancy suits and expensive apartments in the world. 6 months later, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. Eleanor's secretary informed him that someone from Meridian Financial was requesting a meeting. Marcus assumed it was related to business, but was surprised to learn that the caller was James Morrison, Meridian's new CEO, who had been brought in to clean up the firm's reputation after the Blackstone scandal. Morrison wanted to offer Marcus a position as head of institutional services, overseeing the firm's pension fund and endowment management. The salary was enormous, the prestige considerable, and the office would be the corner suite that had once belonged to Richard Blackstone. I appreciate the offer, Marcus told Morrison during their meeting at Meridian, but I'm not interested in returning. May I ask why? The compensation package is substantially higher than what you're earning at Harrison Capital. Marcus looked around the Meridian offices, remembering the young man who had once mopped these floors and dreamed of belonging in these conversations. The marble lobby still gleamed, the expensive suits still commanded respect, and the atmosphere still radiated the kind of institutional power that had once intimidated him. Because I learned something important about worth, Marcus replied. It's not measured by salary or office size. It's measured by the impact you have on people's lives and whether you can look at yourself in the mirror with respect. Morrison seemed genuinely puzzled. But this would be a tremendous career advancement. You'd be managing hundreds of billions in assets. I'm already managing assets that matter to me. Pension funds for teachers, firefighters, and blue-collar workers whose retirement security depends on competent, ethical management. That's more valuable to me than prestige or compensation. As Marcus left the Meridian building for what he knew would be the final time, he passed the supply closet where he'd once hidden to study financial reports. The space looked smaller than he remembered, but it had been the birthplace of his transformation. Not just from janitor to analyst, but from someone who defined himself by others' opinions to someone who understood his own worth. That evening, Marcus called Carlos, his former colleague from the custodial staff, who had since started his own cleaning business. Hermano, remember when that executive humiliated you in front of everyone? How could I forget? Did I ever thank you for what happened that day? Carlos was confused. Thank me? For what? For forcing me to decide who I was going to become. If Blackstone had been kind to me, I might have stayed comfortable and never pushed myself to achieve what I was capable of. His cruelty became the catalyst for my growth. So you're grateful to him? Marcus considered the question carefully. Not grateful to him, but grateful for what I discovered about myself because of him. He told me I was worthless, but what I learned was that worth isn't something other people can give or take away. It's something you have to define for yourself through your actions and choices. 3 years later, Marcus Thompson was featured on the cover of Financial Planning magazine as one of the industry's most innovative pension fund managers. The article highlighted his success in generating stable returns for working-class retirement funds while investing in projects that created jobs and rebuilt American communities. But what meant more to Marcus than professional recognition was a letter he received from a retired Detroit schoolteacher named Margaret Williams. She wrote, "Because of your careful management of our pension fund, I was able to help my granddaughter pay for college. She's studying to become a teacher, just like I was. Thank you for making her dreams possible." Marcus kept the letter in his desk drawer, next to his original worn notebook from his janitor days. Both reminded him of the journey from worthlessness to worth, not as defined by others, but as created by his own choices and actions. The young man who had once cleaned Richard Blackstone's office had indeed proven his former boss wrong. But more importantly, he had proven something to himself. That true success wasn't about climbing higher than those who doubted you, but about becoming someone worthy of the opportunities you'd been given and using those opportunities to lift others along the way. Richard Blackstone's words, "You're worthless," had indeed taken something from Marcus. They had taken his acceptance of other people's definitions of his value. In losing that acceptance, Marcus had found something infinitely more valuable: the knowledge that worth is not inherited, granted, or bestowed by institutions or individuals. It is earned through integrity, demonstrated through service, and measured by the positive impact you have on the world around you. Money had given Marcus everything he thought he wanted: security, respect, and proof of his capabilities. But it was purpose that had given him everything he actually needed: the satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships built on mutual respect, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he had used his talents to make other people's lives better. As Marcus sat in his office overlooking the Hudson River, managing billions in retirement savings for America's working families, he realized that Richard Blackstone had been wrong about almost everything. But he had been accidentally right about one thing. Marcus Thompson was not the same person he had been when he mopped floors at Meridian Financial. He was infinitely more valuable than that person, not because of his salary or status, but because he had learned to define his worth by his character, his contributions, and his commitment to using success as a platform for serving others rather than just serving himself. The question that had haunted him, whether money had cost him his soul, finally had an answer. Money itself was morally neutral. What mattered was how you earned it, what you did with it, and whether you remained connected to the values and people who had shaped you along the way. Marcus Thompson had kept his soul, but more importantly, he had discovered that true worth was something no boss could mock away and no amount of money could buy. It was something you built, day by day, choice by choice, through the kind of person you decided to become and the kind of impact you chose to have on the world around you. And there you have it, Marcus Thompson's incredible journey from janitor to successful investment manager, proving that our worth isn't determined by others' opinions, but by our own actions and integrity. If this story inspired you, please hit that subscribe button because we share amazing real-life transformation stories every week. Leave a comment telling us about a time when someone underestimated you. How did you prove them wrong? And don't forget to hit the like button to help others discover Marcus's powerful story. What would you have done in Marcus's situation? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, your background doesn't determine your destiny. Your determination does.